Today is May 16th, 2018. My name is David Grier, and I'm conducting an oral history interview of Peter E. Friedland. This is part of the ongoing oral history program of the Software Industry Special Interest Group, which is part of the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California. We are here at the Computer History Museum. This interview is being videoed and recorded and will be transcribed, edited, and posted on the Computer Museum History website. So are you ready to begin, sir?
Ready.
July 17th, 1952, Brooklyn, New York. Tell us a little about your family and the Brooklyn that you were born into.
The Brooklyn I was born to. Let's see, well, lived on Ocean Parkway in Flatbush.
Okay.
This was the Brooklyn of great delicatessens and the Brooklyn Dodgers,
Okay.
the old trolley Dodgers. My father was a CPA, my mother a teacher. We moved to Allentown, Pennsylvania when I was 6 and grew up in Allentown. Although most weekends drove back to New York to see our relatives.
Okay, so you went to high school in Allentown.
Went to high school in Allentown.
Okay, was there anything about that high school education that interested you in technology or computers or anything else?
Well, it turns out Allentown was had an extremely enlightened public education program.
Okay.
Starting in 3rd grade, they had special programs for kids who were identified as being good in school, in math, science, English, and the like, called Opportunity School, that lasted through 6th grade. Okay. And then there were honor classes in junior high and high school. Okay. That the public school education in Allentown was really excellent. Also, Allentown was heavily involved in activities like science fairs, mostly because, well, one reason was because the publisher of the Allentown Morning Call, the newspaper, was on the National Board of Science Service, which was running things like the Westinghouse Science Talent Search at the time. Mm-hmm. So the science fair in Allentown was, Lehigh Valley Science Fair was a really big event.
And did you participate?
Yeah, I got first place in chemistry in my junior and senior years and was reserve champion in my senior year, beaten out by another high school student who built a proton accelerator in high school. It was hard to compete with that with just some chemistry programs. Right. But to judge the quality of the Allentown high schools, actually 3 kids from Allentown in my senior year, including myself, were among the 40 winners of or finalists of the Westinghouse Science Talent Search, which our town went crazy over it. Had a testimonial dinner for the 3 of us, among other things. So it was a little bit crazy. It actually resulted that our local congressman and Mack Trucks flew the 3 of us to the Apollo 13 launch, and we sat in the VIP visitor stands next to John Stennis and Spiro Agnew. Wow. And Werner von Braun.
And Werner von Braun.
Actually saw the Apollo 13 launch.
And that is May 74, if I recall?
No, it was much earlier.
May 72.
It was in 70.
May 70.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was either, yes, it must have been May 70, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
I know it's May, and I know it corresponds with the big...
Yeah, it was May 1970, and watching a Saturn V launch was really amazing from close up.
I imagine.
You felt it more than heard it. So anyway, our local school district was, as I said, extremely good. We actually were second only to Bronx High School of Science that year in winners in the Westinghouse Science Talent Search.
And you see, I thought I was going to go down the Bronx High School of Science because of where you were. But chemistry, what led you to chemistry?
A couple things. I mean, I'd always been interested in sciences. Built electronic kits and Heath kits. I don't know if you're old enough to remember Heath kits, but in fact, watched the Apollo moon landing, Apollo 11, on a Heath kit color TV I'd built myself. So had always been interested in that. And I really got serious about chemistry when I went to an NSF summer science program. Back then, it's unfortunate there aren't as many of these now. Back then, NSF sponsored a whole bunch of summer high school science enrichment programs. Right. and I went to one at the Mount Herman School in New Hampshire, where college professors taught chemistry.
Okay.
So, in fact, I got interested in certain types of inorganic chemistry at that program, and also it was actually my first experience to time-sharing computing, because they actually had a terminal for the Dartmouth BASIC system, the first real practical time-sharing system.
And so this would have been in?
This was the summer of '69.
Summer of '69, okay, yep.
So when I came back from that, besides doing a project there, I also was very fortunate that I got involved working with a college professor at Muhlenberg College in Allentown. Last name was Staley, I forget his first name now, but he was sort of my mentor in chemistry, and that's actually where I did my project for the Westinghouse Science Talent Search.
Ah, okay.
So there was sort of a dual theme of interest in computers and chemistry. My high school actually had an IBM 1620, which you have here downstairs in the Computer Museum, which was my first real computer. Okay. And there was a computer club at my high school who actually made a lot of money by running a computer matching dance.
Okay, and at Dartmouth, you obviously would be learning to program in BASIC.
Well, it was at Mount Herman School.
At the Mount Herman School.
Learned how to program in BASIC.
In BASIC, and
yeah.
on the 1620?
The Fortran.
Fortran.
Well, before Fortran, actually, before we actually got a Fortran compiler and a disk, we actually were programming an SPS, symbolic programming system. And it was actually, when we got a Fortran compiler, it was before we actually got one of the hard disks, which you also have downstairs here. So you actually put your program into the punch card reader, and first into a pre-compiler to check for errors, and then into a compiler, and you actually got back a deck of object code, which you put back into the computer. So then in my senior year, we got a disk, a big disk drive, so you no longer had to re-enter your object code into the computer. So that was my first serious exposure to computers and also to serious chemistry.
Okay, and on your resume you list the scientific programmer Air Products and Chemical Corporation, and that's the working with the mentor, and that's the thing that moved you into the...
Well, no, the mentor was at Muhlenberg College. That was sort of during the school time.
So let's get to this.
I had a summer job for 2 years as a programmer at Air Products and Chemicals, which was, actually people get the wrong impression of Allentown from the Billy Joel song, which was really about Bethlehem, not Allentown, which was a steel town. Allentown was a much more mixed industry town. There was the Bell Labs, and Air Products was one of the biggest employers, and I got a summer job at Air Products as a programmer for 2 summers.
And what sort of programs did you write for them?
It was working mostly on programs that modeled the condition of various gases at very cold temperatures. Okay. There's a thing I still remember called the virial equation of state that allows you to model pressure and temperature, et cetera, as gases are compressed and into liquid form. And I rewrote some of those programs and modified some of them. Just did general programming work, okay. mostly in Fortran.
Mostly in Fortran, closely supervised, or they sort of say, here's the problem, do it?
A combination of both. Certainly closely supervised originally, and then when I turned out to be a good programmer, less so. But worked closely. I think the head of the department's last name was Israel. I think, was it Steve Israel? Anyway, he was a very good mentor and for learning more advanced programming.
All right. And then in September 1970, you go to Princeton.
Yes.
And you applied, and your Westinghouse scholarship helped draw their attention to you?
Yeah, I think it pretty much guaranteed entry. That, being one of the 40 winners in the Westinghouse Science Talent Search that year pretty much guaranteed you got into whatever college you wanted. Okay. And actually, it was 3 kids from my high school, not the same ones, Westinghouse winner, but all got into Harvard, MIT, and MIT that year, and we all turned down Harvard, which made the local Harvard rep almost die. He'd never had 3 kids get into Harvard from Allentown before, and we all turned Harvard down. 2 went to MIT, 2 of my friends went to MIT, and I went to Princeton. One of the things that attracted me to Princeton was I also wanted to have more, as an undergraduate, be exposed to not just science and engineering, but all forms of that. I'd actually during my high school days, I'd also been a pretty good writer. Actually, I had an article in the Atlantic Monthly. There was an Atlantic Monthly writing contest.
All right, and what was the article on?
It was actually an essay on the book Too Late, the Phalarope by the South African writer. What was his name? Most famous South African writer, you must know.
And it's, I'll butcher your Cry the Beloved Country.
Yes, Peyton, right, yes, right, very good. You're a historian and writer, you should know these things. I should remember these things.
We all should remember.
So the other thing that really attracted me to Princeton was I'd been reading in a journal that a new professor had come to Princeton named Todd Whipke, who was sort of interested in the mix of computer science and chemistry.
Okay.
And I had written him during the summer, and one thing about Princeton that's very nice is that even though it's obviously one of the great universities, undergraduates really come first. There's a lot more undergraduates than, it's a relatively small school, about 4,000 undergrads and about 1,000 grads at the time. And undergraduates, it is not unusual for them to be heavily involved in research programs from day one. As opposed to a place like Stanford where, while undergraduates sometimes do get involved, that's much more of a rarity. It's basically graduate students doing work with professors on research. So I got involved with Todd's project from day one, from being there. Had a job as a research assistant, as opposed to working in the cafeteria or something. And the project was a theme that actually continues to today, which was using computer science means, using AI to help design synthetic pathways for chemical reactions.
Okay.
So how do you design a set of reactions to produce a given desired molecule, whether it be a drug or any other desired molecule? What's the pathway to doing that? And also, he jointly with another professor, Bob Langridge, who is a computer graphics chemistry guy, had won an NSF award for a DEC PDP-10 computer. So it was a great system to program on, and I ended up doing my senior thesis. In fact, at Princeton, everyone does a major research project with a senior thesis. In fact, probably the most famous senior thesis ever that came out of Princeton was Wendy Kopp's one that was the plan for Teach for America that started as a senior thesis at Princeton. My daughter ended up working for them for a while. Okay. But anyway, so I was a member of this research team for 4 years. And it was an introduction both to AI and to computer chemistry.
Okay. And so you very much went to Princeton knowing that chemistry was going to be where you were going, what you were going to be studying.
Well, I was interested in both chemistry and computer science.
Right.
And I'd always been interested in the combination of computer science with solving hard problems in science and engineering and medicine.
And what did you take in terms of computer science while you were there?
Well, my advisor actually was, turned out was Peter Denning. When I went to Stanford, I don't know if you know Peter, but
yeah, I know.
When I went to Princeton, there was no computer science department. This was in 1970. Right. The computer scientists were in the EE department. And so I took courses. Peter was my advisor. I took a course from him on essentially operating systems and hardware. So things like paging and all that sort of stuff. There was a course on pattern recognition from, I think, Theo Pavlidis, which was the closest to an AI course there. Although an AI course was started, and I forget who taught it, in my senior year. And there was a course in numerical analysis. Right. That was the hardest course I ever took. There were 5 people in it. And one person got an A, 2 people got Fs out of the 5. One got a D+, and it was my only C at college, and I got a C+, and that was probably the proudest I was ever of a grade. A guy named Foreman Acton taught the course. And the book was Computer Methods That Work, and if you looked at the cover and turned a certain angle, engraved in it was usually. So sort of my first introduction to heuristics. But I was also very lucky. I think probably my favorite courses at Princeton were several in history and philosophy of science, taught by people like Thomas Kuhn, who of course wrote about paradigm shifts, and C.C. Gillespie, The Edge of Objectivity, and Mike Levy. And actually, I think my favorite little bit of discovery at Princeton was a paper I wrote for one of the history and philosophy of science courses. I delved into the library, into the journal of the British Academy. Right. And I think I found the earliest connection between electricity and magnetism. It was like a letter to the editor, as it were, in the, I think the 1400s or 1500s, of a ship captain who was asking the learned academy to explain how come when a lightning bolt hit near the ship, his compass went crazy. So, so I wrote a paper on that, and I was very proud of, I think, discovering one of the first mentions of that connection between electricity and magnetism. So history and philosophy of science, I took a course on modern literature from, good Lord, I just forgot his name, from the guy who actually was Hemingway's official biographer. So being able to take courses like that was pretty amazing.
So you did a fairly broad group of things, and yet you still went directly towards computer science.
Yeah, and I actually got dual degrees in chemistry and electrical engineering.
Okay, and both of those things by themselves would have been, but you chose electrical engineering, more specifically computers.
Well, it was because that's where computer science was, and I was also interested in electrical engineering. Okay. As I said, I like putting together Heathkits and the like, but it was a pretty broad background. I got a physics course from a guy who turned out to be famous also later, P.J. Peebles. Mm-hmm. I learned about your basic introduction to electromagnetism and physics.
But you're coming to the end of it, and you have choices. You clearly could have gotten a very well-paying job. You could have gone to graduate school in chemistry or chemical engineering. You could have gone towards a professor. And you go to Stanford for computer science.
Yeah.
What were you considering?
Well, I had decided that I wanted to get a PhD in computer science. At that time, I was starting to get really interested in AI. Mm-hmm. And the top 3 computer science places were Stanford, MIT, and Carnegie Mellon. Yes. And I applied to all of them. I got into all 3 of them. And I decided to go to Stanford, despite the fact I'd never been west of St. Louis. I think I was leaning towards that anyway. I got a call from Ed Feigenbaum, telling me that I really should go to Stanford because it was, at the time, it was snowing everywhere else, and he was playing tennis.
So pitching the weather.
The weather in California certainly turned out to be a draw, and having now been here for 44 years and lost all immunity to humidity, right. I can't stand going to places like Florida anymore.
Okay. But it was artificial intelligence that pulled you here.
It was that, and it was particularly the connection. Professor Feigenbaum had started what was called the Heuristic Programming Project. Yes. And it was the connection between AI and really interesting applications in the sciences and medicine and engineering that made Stanford particularly attractive.
Okay, and during your work at Stanford, you worked on a couple programs. The CONGEN program for constrained generation of chemical structures, and the MOLGEN project?
Yes, well, there's the first big expert system or knowledge-based system ever built was a program called Dendril, which was a collaboration between computer scientists like Ed Feigenbaum and very famous chemists like Carl Djerassi, who of course was famous for a lot of reasons and died recently, which is very sad. But Djerassi, of course, besides being an incredibly good chemist and the discoverer of the birth control pill and the founder of Syntax, was also a playwright and had several well-produced plays on the national scale, on the national level. But he was an expert, and they jointly and their students designed a system which was able to outperform expert human chemists in taking mass spectra and predicting what was the structure of an organic compound. CONGEN was the constrained generator part of Dendril that produced potential candidate molecules based on the mass spectra. And the first program I worked on there when I was getting my PhD was do some work on CONGEN. I wasn't a major contributor, but I wrote some of the code for that. I got involved. I was very lucky to be at Stanford at the time, just at the time when molecular biology had moved from being a very data-poor science to a very data-rich one. Until about 1974, 75, determining the base sequence of DNA, the string of the letters A, G, C, and T that makes up our genetic code and it's the language of life. Being able to determine, say, 10 base pairs was an effort of many, many man-months, a laborious, extremely laborious chemical process. But almost simultaneously in 1974, 75, two teams, one in the US, which was Wally Gilbert and Alan Maxim, and one in Britain, Sanger and Coulson. Sanger was Professor Coulson, his postdoc, developed two different techniques that enabled you to read hundreds of base pairs in a short period of time. And that meant that now, instead of having very small amounts of data, molecular biologists had potentially thousands and thousands of base pairs of data. So at that time, one of Ed Feigenbaum's major collaborators who had introduced him to Carl Djerassi was Josh Lederberg, who was a Nobel laureate, became a Nobel laureate in biochemistry, left Stanford in, I think, in 1979, I think, 78, to become president of Rockefeller University. But Josh, Ed had been asking Josh, is your field ready for collaboration with computer science? And Josh had said, not yet, until then. And he said, yes. So I was looking for a PhD thesis project, and so I was lucky enough to stumble at the right time into the interaction of molecular biology. And thesis was about attempting to model the process by which human scientists design experiments in molecular biology.
Okay. And I just have to throw this in because this is another part. During your period was early days of ARPANET?
Yes.
Did that shape your research environment at all?
I would say not in the early days. What shaped the research environment then was Stanford had a DEC 10 and later a KL20 DEC time-sharing machine that came as a result of an NIH grant for artificial intelligence in medicine. So Stanford was a major part of that community that included scientists across the US. So having email connectivity to many of those scientists through the network was important. But the most important thing was having easy access to, first to the time-sharing system where we did our work, and then later we moved about halfway through my PhD project, everyone moved sort of from that framework for doing their actual computing work to specialized list machines. At Stanford, it was mainly machines from Xerox, what were called the D machines. Dolphin, Dorado, there was another D machine, I forget the name of it. So we sort of had our individual D machines.
For your work, rather. Okay, this is before 79.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we had D machines starting in, when did we have D machines? It must have been starting in about 1970, 78 or so.
So towards the end of your dissertation?
Towards the end of my dissertation.
Okay. Going on to sort of a theme that comes out of yesterday, you were working in artificial intelligence, but were very clearly identified with a specific problem, or if we use the business term, vertical.
Yes.
How important was that fact, the fact that you were something of an expert in the chemistry involved? How did that shape your work on the artificial intelligence? Did it make it easier?
Well, I mean, I didn't have I did not have a background in biochemistry. Yeah. So I did a lot of reading and learning, and mostly being able to getting time from the great biochemists and geneticists at Stanford and their PhD students and postdocs was what was extremely important. So I learned a lot about biochemistry then.
But did that shape the computing?
Well, the way in which the molecular biologists thought is what shaped the computing. Okay. Learning how the human experts designed experiments is what shaped. I mean, it was very much the approach of not modeling things at a neural behavior. We weren't building neuromorphic computing systems, but attempting to model in the computer the reasoning processes that truly expert scientists use in designing experiments is what shaped the RAI approach to things.
And you have to explain RAI.
No, O-U-R.
Oh,
R-A-I. Our way of doing AI.
Yes. Okay, we'll strike that.
So we were not building formal logic models of human thinking. We were building sometimes rule-based, sometimes what's called frame-based representations of human processes. And probably the major innovation I developed as part of my thesis work was the notion that, let me go back just a little bit. Designing experiments is a planning problem. And most prior AI planning work had been in very simple domains, usually the domain called the blocks world, where you're starting with 3 or 4 or 5 blocks and designing the plan to move them from one configuration to another. Right. And that's what's called a combinatoric problem, because there are many possible states of those blocks. And the problem was, how do you navigate this space? When do you backtrack? And how do you design the most efficient plan to go from state A to state B, from a starting state to a final state? Now, the discovery that I had was that human experts almost never do that. They almost never do backtracking. So in designing an experiment, if a step in a biochemistry experiment makes it too hot for the next step in your plan, you don't go back and redesign the first step, you make it colder in most cases. If it makes it too acidic, you do something to make it more basic. You do a repair step. So my view is that planning in the science field I was studying, at least, was not particularly combinatoric, but was very knowledge rich. Okay. And so the problem was teaching the planning system enough knowledge to know how to fix things along the way. And the other discovery I had was that in this field, scientists rarely design things de novo. They took what other people had done and modified them. So, for example, one of the major types of experiments that was being done in biochemistry was cloning experiments. So actually, there were 3 things that had revolutionized biochemistry. One was all that came about at the same time period. One was the method for doing sequencing, which resulted in lots and lots of data. The second was the discovery of what was called restriction enzymes. Prior to that, when you were cutting DNA into manageable pieces, it was a totally random process. You threw it into something that denatured the DNA and cut it up into random pieces, and then if you were lucky, you got pieces about the right size. A discovery, and I forget who discovered it, was that there were certain enzymes which specifically look for patterns of 4, 5, or 6 bases in a row. The base pairs of A, G, C, and T, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, and would cut only when it found exactly that pattern of 4, 5, or 6 bases. So now you had a tool for snipping DNA at precise places, into precise pieces. And the third thing was the innovation of Stan Cohn and Boyer. I forget his first name. Stan Cohn was is famous Stanford geneticist. Boyer, famous cow geneticist, and actually UCSF, sorry, not Cal, UCSF geneticist, who developed a technique called cloning, which enabled you now for the first time, if you had a piece of DNA you wanted to make a lot of copies of, so you could analyze it of what doing was called cloning experiments. How do you do cloning? And they developed a technique for doing that. And they actually wrote a very short little book I got a copy of, which explained the steps to do cloning. And that resulted in thousands of cloning experiments worldwide, basically following the plan of 7 or 8 steps, but modifying each step accordingly to the needs of their own experiment. So in fact, I ended up designing a system called skeletal planning, which took this skeletal plan, this framework for a plan, and figured out how to instantiate it for a whole host of different experiments. So instead of there being lots of combinatoric backtracking, like in a typical planning problem, there was almost none of that. The work there was the knowledge in knowing how to specialize each step in that plan and when to insert other little intermediate steps to correct things. That was a view for how scientists designed experiments.
Okay, and the question I have is, this goes against the common vision of planning. And is this what does this provide as insight into the problems of artificial intelligence?
Well, since
it certainly simplifies.
Well, since we in the Heuristic Programming Project, and later named the Knowledge Systems Laboratory, we're very interested in how humans design stuff. Ed Feigenbaum had come from the Newell and Simon legacy at Carnegie Mellon. That's where he got his PhD. And in Simon's famous book, The Science of the Artificial, he describes, in fact, that one reason for studying human cognitive behavior is to learn a way to model it in a computer. So other PhD students, Ted Shortliff, who designed the Meisen system, and MD himself, modeled the system after what he viewed were the rules that infectious disease experts used, consciously or unconsciously, to decide what antibiotics to use. Other students were doing other problems in, the Dendro project was modeled after how folks like Gerasi thought about problems in mass spectral analysis. Other students were doing projects in other areas of science and engineering. There was one student who was modeling how lawyers think about developing arguments in court. So in my case, we were learning about, at least the best we could, about how human scientists thought about and designed experiments.
And just talk for a moment about knowledge capture, since that was the theme of yesterday.
Yes.
You were involved in knowledge capture, and that led you to develop a model of human.
I suppose I proudly would call myself a knowledge engineer.
You're a knowledge engineer. Tell us about knowledge capture. What did you learn about knowledge capture in this process?
Well, the first thing is that it's a pleasure to talk to domain experts and to get them thinking about how they do reasoning. And it's not always obvious at first to them how they think about problems, but the people I worked with actually really enjoyed thinking deeper about how they actually did their work in science. So knowledge engineering is really a process of engaging experts and getting them to think with you rigorously about how they solve problems. And folks like Josh Lederberg and Doug Brutlag, another biochemistry professor at Stanford, and Larry Kettis, a professor of medicine at Stanford, and their postdocs. I think it gave them more insight into how they were solving hard problems. Okay. And so we tried very hard to figure out accurately how they were thinking. And that sometimes took a while to go from, I just had a fast flash of insight to what did that really mean? What did you have to think about? What was the knowledge you used to make that discovery? There was actually a later project where I supervised a PhD student, Pete Karp, who's now head of biochemistry computing at SRI. We studied a scientist called Charlie Yanofsky, who probably would have gotten a Nobel Prize, except he died too soon. But he had a remarkable insight into solving genetic regulation in the tryptophan gene. That it was a problem that was really great for studying because all the information was there that any trained biochemist could have come up with the insight he did. And he did only because he actually was able to think in 2 dimensions at once, to imagine the ribosome both as a machine for producing proteins, but also as taking up space. And turned out nature had evolved a genetic regulatory mechanism that took advantage of that. And when he had this flash of insight, which was caused by him being able to think in 2 dimensions at once, it turned out to be correct. And that was an amazing discovery. So I really enjoyed the time spent with those experts trying to figure out how they think, and also trying to figure out what knowledge specifically they used in solving their problems, which became the bulk of the knowledge that we encoded within our systems.
Okay. You finished your PhD in '79.
Yes.
And you stay in the computer science department.
Stayed in there as a senior research associate because there was a lot more work to do in the MOLGEN project. Turning what I had done into a system that could be duplicated for other problems in molecular biology. Had a really good PhD student called Yumi Iwazaki, who refined the skeletal plan concept into a system that could be repeated on many different systems. And Pete Karp, I mentioned, who modeled the thinking of this other famous biologist, Charlie Yanofsky. And I stayed there in the computer science department until 1987.
But you could have gone elsewhere. You would have, if you had wished to have been a professor of computer science.
I didn't really want to, it turned out I didn't really want to be a professor. I really enjoyed doing the research more than the teaching. I enjoyed working with 1 or 2 students at a time, not teaching big classes. So I wanted to stay in research of that type.
Okay, a little bit of an aside, but it's relevant to people who research these sorts of things. You were with the university. The interaction with SRI, did you have any? What was it like?
Well, SRI, I did, because SRI had a really good AI group of people also. Nils Nilsson, Peter Hart, Dick Duda, lots, Earl Sacerdoti, lots of folks. And they were also doing work in planning. And I served a whole community of work doing that. Nils, I ended up being the one, it was mostly a research assistant at Stanford, for my stipend as part of our PhD project. Although I did one little thing as a teaching assistant for Nils in his course on AI, introductory course on AI. So that was my one experience to teaching large groups of people. And I also became the editor for Nils's book on artificial intelligence. So frequently visited the SRI folks because they were our colleagues. Many of them had joint appointments at Stanford. Nils was at both places at once. So SRI was part of the same group of people doing this work.
But it was just sort of a world apart, and you were friendly and interacted on some things, but...
They were research colleagues. I mean, we got together for joint seminars. I asked people like Nils for advice on my thesis. In fact, I think Nils, God, I'm trying to remember, this is silly, I don't remember. I believe Nils was on my thesis committee, so...
Well, this is good. But during the same time frame that you're doing this, you're also with IntelliCorp. And you list 3, IntelliCorp, Intelligenetics, Technology in Palo Alto, California.
Technology.
Yes.
Yes. Well, as I was just about finished with my PhD thesis in 1979, to back up a bit, one of the things we did to, from our point of view, getting 3-4 hours a week of deep conversation with all these wonderful scientists. It was incredible. And one of the things we did to pay them back was write some pretty simple computer programs from our point of view that didn't have much to do with AI in DNA sequence analysis, DNA and protein sequence analysis. So essentially finding patterns in the strings. Now that they had this data, they were looking for stuff. What were interesting patterns in the data? What were the portions of a DNA strand that actually encoded for proteins, and what were other stuff that were basically control signals for when to stop and start doing that. So I ended up writing some programs for that, and they turned out to be useful. And the folks who they were useful for talked about them to their colleagues who also were getting these data, and all of a sudden we had lots and lots of molecular biologists around the country wanting to use these programs. And they were running still on our time sharing system, on some XAIM computer. And we actually created a guest account called Genet, G-E-N-E-T, that provided access to, eventually, to lots and lots of outside scientists. And we got credit for that in lots of research papers that people wrote. And it got to a point, two things happened. One, it got to the point where the director of SumXAIM, Tom Rindfleisch, politely asked us, we're using 2/3 of the cycles on SumXAIM. Could you please get off and find your own computer? And also, there became a sort of an issue. We had no problem with releasing this stuff for free to academic scientists. But now there was a growing molecular biology industry. Companies were being formed. And scientists at Stanford, at lots of places, were wearing dual hats at the companies they started in at their universities. And while we thought it was quite reasonable, since we were funded by NSF and NIH, to let them use cycles on SumX, it didn't seem right to let the companies freely use this stuff. And basically got a ruling that they weren't allowed to. Led to a few hard feelings because scientists at other universities were wearing dual hats. Well, how come you let me use it for my research work at Dartmouth or someplace, but I can't use it at the company I started? And we said, well, that creates a conflict with the federal government with providing free access on this machine to corporate ventures. So we realized those two things at once. We realized, first of all, we didn't want to abandon the community, so we were going to have to get our own computer. And we also saw this growing commercial market. Plus, there now was starting to be this growing commercial interest in expert systems. So I think it was in early '79, we were talking a little bit about forming a company. And there was sort of going around the entire HPP, Heuristic Programming Project, should we all get together and form a company? So Ed and I were sort of the strongest in saying, yeah, we should do this. And we offered the opportunity to join us of all of our colleagues in HPP. And they said, nah, we're not that interested at the time. But our two main biological collaborators at the time, Larry Kedis and Doug Brutlag, were. So we said, well, let's form a company that both does the bioinformatics type of work, as well as explores uses of AI in science and other applications. So the goal was to one, take the stuff we developed at Stanford, which now we had permission to license from Stanford, because the NSF had decided that instead of software being developed as part of university grants, that it was public domain, that actually was owned by the university, with the proviso that the university really do an honest job of making it commercial and available to the world as a whole. So the software we developed that for DNA protein sequence analysis, we had the beginnings of what we thought was a product, an AI product for molecular biologists to help them design experiments. And thirdly, we had general tools for building AI systems that we thought could be generalized to other applications. So we started this company. I remember sitting around in Doug's house in Ladera, a community near here, and thinking about names. And to be honest, I don't remember whether it was me or Larry who first thought of Intelligenetics.
Okay.
I think it was a group affair. So we created a company called Intelligenetics, and it being Silicon Valley, did the rounds of venture capitalists, got a lawyer. Yeah. Lawyers in Silicon Valley serve several purposes, but probably the most important one from my point of view is they become your business advisors. Mm-hmm. And most law firms will basically waive your fees until you raise venture capital money as part of being part of your advisory team. Mm-hmm. So we found a great lawyer, Greg Gallo. Mm-hmm. At the time, the company was Ware, Fletcher, and Friedland. Went through about 8 different name changes over the next 20 years. But Greg Gallo was a senior partner there. Mm-hmm. And he adopted us, and we adopted him. And in fact, he became the lawyer for all the companies I founded. So Intelligenetics got started. Right. Now, interestingly enough, about 2 years later, the group of people at Stanford who hadn't wanted to form a company decided, oh yeah, it's time to form one. Right. So 20 of us, well actually it was about 14 or 15 people from our Stanford group, and then a couple other of our strong colleagues like Rick Hayes Roth, who was at Rand, mm-hmm. and a couple other people who were basic colleagues and friends, some from SRI, formed a company called Teknowledge, which was designed to be a training and tool building company originally for AI systems. So I was still at Stanford, but spent a certain percentage of my time at Intelligenetics, mm-hmm. and later a smaller percentage at Teknowledge, on the board, helping design things. Right. And one of the first things we did at Intelligenetics was applied to the NIH Division of Research Resources, which had funded the SumX AIM computer, for a replacement system specifically for serving the academic molecular biology community. Okay. And that was called BioNet. Okay. So we wrote a proposal for BioNet. Right. It got awarded, had a 5-year grant, and we ran that for the community, and literally thousands of projects across the country and across the world used that resource. Until 5 years later, we applied for renewal, but at that time there was a lot of rumbling in the community about, do we really want this run by a commercial company, even though we were running it as a nonprofit, just taking expenses from the BioNet facility, charging minimal fees to pay for costs. And actually I remember one group of scientists didn't have the $1,000 or so to pay the year of BioNet use for academics, and actually had a BioNet bake sale to raise the money.
But could we? There's an interesting set of questions around.
Okay, go ahead.
Because this shows a tech company breaking away from a university.
Yes, which became increasingly common at Stanford.
Which becomes increasingly common. Sure. But you talked about first how you created accounts on the original
SumX AIM machine.
SumX AIM machine for them to use. But this is still in the age of ARPANET.
Yeah.
That's the only connection they have. So it's basically you're starting with just the communities of ARPA.
Well, by that time, most universities had nodes on the ARPANET.
Most research
universities did. And they were able to log on. Well, there are a couple ways to log on to SumX AIM. Yeah. Certainly you could do it through the ARPANET. Yeah. Actually, most people logged on in the early days through their 1400 baud modem. Yeah. I mean, there was a dial-up number through Telnet. Right. In fact, actually, I take that back. Very few actually used an ARPANET connection. Okay. That was mainly limited still to the major research universities. Yeah. So most users of the Gen account on SumX AIM logged on through their friendly headphone into the coupler modems.
The Texas Instruments silent.
That was the most of the time we're using things like what was the company that was making the smart terminals? Data something, I forget. Actually, we had then Heathkit Zenith produced a smart terminal for less price. Right. And we actually had a building party among grads. We offered every grad student in the computer science department one year a free Heathkit Zenith smart terminal if they built it. Right. So we had a building party where I taught them how to build Heathkits over a weekend.
But going again to this separation process.
Yes.
You know, you have it set up. It's working where you set it up basically for the use of academics.
Yes.
It's clearly expanding that.
Yes.
You set up a separate computer facility.
We moved from SumXAIM
Yep.
to BioNet.
To BioNet.
Yes.
And BioNet was located where?
It was located physically. God, where was it located physically?
But it was not on campus at that point.
No, it was not on campus. Was it physically at our at an Intelligenetics location? God, I don't even remember. I think we rented separate space for the computer facility.
Okay. But it's a separate computer.
It's a separate computer. It's a separate DEC KL10 computer,
and then
KL20 computer.
And then it is in effect selling services back to the university.
Yeah.
And universities.
It wasn't really selling services. There was we were required to do cost recovery,
Right.
and use the money from NIH to buy the computer and to use for separate research projects that Intelligenetics did, and you could apply to do separate research projects on computing and biochemistry on the system.
Okay.
But the sort of production use for DNA sequence analysis and the like
Yeah.
was done on a cost recovery basis.
Okay.
And it was a very small amount. I mean, it was to pay for maintenance and operation of the system. So it was like, you know, $100 a month or something.
Okay. So this was very much a non-for-profit activity.
The use, BioNet was definitely a not-for-profit
And in fact, not
activity.
only non-for-profit, it was subsidized by your NIH grant.
Oh, well, NIH paid, the grant paid for the computer.
Right.
And it paid for
Operations?
specifically, operations we did cost recovery for.
Okay.
It paid for some of the staff
Right.
costs. And it also paid for, specifically we were required to do at least and N was like 5 or 10,
Right.
research projects under the grant for advancing the art of computer-aided biochemistry.
Okay.
And people applied for those. Some people at Intelligenetics could apply for that, but an independent board of advisors decided who got the research grants to do computer-aided molecular biology.
Okay, again, sort of working on this arc a little bit. You're listed as founder and vice president?
I was the founder and vice president of
Vice president
Intelligenetics.
for what? Or just vice president, they handed out you the title?
Yeah, yes.
Be a vice president.
And member of the board.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this ran through 76, 86, or that was your participation and it ran longer?
Well, Intelligenetics, the company, it was interesting. The company went public in 1983,
Okay.
mostly based on the expanding trend of computer-aided molecular biology.
Right.
So the biology part of the company
Right.
caused it to go public.
And
But starting in around 84, 85,
yeah.
the expert systems trend in the world, the hype in the world, became the dominant force. And our second offering was almost entirely fueled by that growth. So the molecular biology part dominated the company in the first several years, but slowly and then rapidly, the expert system tool and application part
Right.
began to become transcendent.
But you have an IPO in 1983, 4 years after you began operation?
Yeah.
And you have enough revenue that the bankers feel good about all this and felt you can sell this?
In the words of Tom Weisel, head of Montgomery Securities, revenue is a bad thing. Remember, the motto of that period of time in the internet world, like, was the power of growth.
Right.
So, profit was a bad thing. Revenue wasn't bad. Profit was bad. Revenue was supposed to be used to fuel growth. So you got measured on projected growth of the company as opposed to individual revenues and, God forbid, profit.
Right.
So we did have substantial revenues. I think by 83 we had, I didn't bring it with me, the detailed list, but I think by 83 was about $2 million a year.
And people will be looking it up who use this thing anyway.
Yeah,
So-
about $2 million a year in revenue. in '84, it was about 5 million, and it jumped to like 10 million right after our second public offering.
And here's the question: that money, some of that was cost recovery, and some of that was from your commercial use. And
well, I'm talking about revenue. I'm not
commercial?
counting the cost recovery.
So that's entirely from the commercial side.
Entirely from the commercial side.
Okay. And then, so that does an IPO in 83.
Yep.
This lists your termination as 86. You move on from this? Do you stay on the board?
Well, I didn't really. In January 1987, I became part of NASA.
Right.
So my time available for participation became extremely limited.
Right.
It turned out the Intelligenetics side, but okay, so by this time, in 1986,
right.
It was decided to, the company, when we had our second IPO in 86, by then, a year earlier, because of the fact that the computer science side, the AI side was growing,
yep.
we decided to rename the company IntelliCorp.
Right.
And Intelligenetics became a sort of a division, a branch
right.
of IntelliCorp.
Right.
And then in 1986, Amico,
right.
who was a significant customer of IntelliCorp,
right.
But mostly on the Intelligenetics side,
right.
offered to buy a 60% share in Intelligenetics. In other words, to take the Intelligenetics division,
right.
physically move it away,
right.
and make it a joint venture between IntelliCorp and Amico, with Amico owning 60%.
Right.
So it moved, half a mile down El Camino,
right.
to from the Intelligenetics at this time offices, which was where was it? It was at Rengstorff and El Camino, in an office complex there. Moved it down to across San Antonio, across Grant Road,
right.
the other side of Grant Road in Mountain View.
Right.
Intelligenetics, I think, was still in Los Altos, and IntelliCorp was in Los Altos, and we moved Intelligenetics to Mountain View, mm-hmm. and still in El Camino, and ran it as a separate company.
Right.
Now, at this time, after I joined NASA in '87, I really didn't have much involvement in IntelliCorp, because part of that might have been a conflict with what I was doing for the federal government,
right.
but I was still on the advisory board for Intelligenetics,
right.
which wasn't a conflict, which was ruled not a conflict.
All right.
So I was still a stockholder in
yeah, you just had no active participation.
I had no
limited active participation.
In the IntelliCorp side, I mean, I still had friends there,
yeah.
but I had no active participation in IntelliCorp after I joined NASA in '87.
Okay. And then just sort of coming on the other company of this era, TeleKnowledge. Is that the one?
Teknowledge.
I keep on making it Tele, don't I? TechKnowledge.
TechKnowledge.
You were primarily a consultant on that.
Yes.
And
I was a co-founder, one of 20 co-founders, and what I did for TechKnowledge was occasionally, in that period until 1987, participate in site visits to potential customers,
okay.
Where we would learn about their problems and describe how TechKnowledge could provide expert system solutions to their problems.
Okay, but you've already hinted at the next stage of your career, which is NASA, which starts in January '87.
Yes.
How did that job come about?
Well, in '86 or beyond, I was thinking about what I wanted to do next.
Right.
We had sort of come to a point in MOLGEN where we could declare success and be happy with its spin-offs and things. Right. It turned out that my old advisor at Princeton, Peter Denning, mm-hmm. Was now head of an organization called REACS, Research Institute for Advanced Computer Science, which was on the NASA Ames campus and was sort of their in-house advanced computer science shop. Mm-hmm. And in late 1986, mm-hmm. the space station program was being planned.
Right.
And one of the things that Congress mandated, So I learned some interesting things about the way things operate. So it turned out the most powerful person as far as NASA was concerned at that time was not the NASA administrator, but a person with the rather unassuming title of Chief Clerk of the House Appropriations Subcommittee for HUD and Independent Agencies. And this is a guy by the name of Dick Mallow, who basically designed the legislation involving space policy. And one of the things he got into the legislation was that the space station program was to devote up to 10% of revenue to research and development in automation and robotics. Autonomous systems and robotics. And that meant that NASA now believed that it really needed to develop a substantial AI and robotics program. And Peter Denning, actually, we had still kept in touch, called me and said, you know, NASA wants to create this program. There may be a few people there now who know a little bit about AI. And there were a few people sort of around all the different NASA centers who knew a little bit about AI, but no serious research program. So at the time, the center director, Bill Ballhouse, who is tied for being the best boss I ever had, Bill was one of the few people who was both a really good CEO and COO at the same time. What I mean is he had the vision and the way to describe it of a CEO, but he also both knew how to run things and he knew how to hire a deputy who was really good at running things. So I talked to Ballhouse and what they wanted to build. And I asked him I forget who told me the most important question you should ever ask someone like that is how long are you going to be around?
How long was he going to be?
Well, he said he certainly had no plans on leaving, and he really wanted to see this develop. And he was someone who had come up through the ranks as an engineer who had sort of pioneered the concept of computation through flight, which means Ames had the largest, had, and when I went there still had, the largest collection of wind tunnels in the world. And wind tunnels are used for the design of aircraft. But he pioneered work in computational fluid dynamics and the way it interacted with testing in wind tunnels, so you could basically do computer design as a major complement to the wind tunnel design and eliminate the need in many respects for wind tunnel testing of certain types. So he had developed this computation, do CFD work, do sort of final work in wind tunnels, design the aircraft, and use what you had designed in modeling it as part of understanding its performance during actual flight tests. So he was an engineer turned executive, was the Ames, been appointed Ames Center Director, and he basically said, I will give you the resources to make this happen, and I'll have your, if you do sensible things that sort of violate the rules, I'll have your back. And that meant things like there's a certain number of slots I can give you, and I'll get you all I can. Slots for civil servants, but if that's not enough to do, you can hire contractors, and for all practical purposes, treat them like civil servants. And things that were normally verboten and probably did violate the regulations, like sharing offices, and for all practical purposes, senior contractors, having civil servants underneath them in teams. We did. And it was probably technically against formal regulations. It certainly wasn't illegal. But Bill said, basically, as long as you get what's done and make me look good, I'll have your back. And we also had a couple of people at NASA headquarters who applied the funding who became part of our team and really felt the same way. A guy named Mel Montemerlo, who was my partner in crime from 87 to 95 while I was at NASA. And his boss, Lee Holcomb, really during that period, from 87 until about 1994, it was a pleasure to work at NASA. And one thing I learned afterwards, and with my respect with the Air Force, is that the federal government can either be a good place or a terrible place to do R&D. It's a good place, and not just R&D, to get missions done. If the infrastructure it believes they're part of the team if they're behind you.
Yep.
If procurement and legal and contracting and personnel and the like, I said procurement and contracting, they're both the same thing, are behind you and they believe they're part of the mission, it's a pleasure to work there. Mm-hmm. You can get things done. If those organizations believe their job is to protect the organization from crazy scientists as opposed to help them make things get done, it can be a real pain to work there.
Okay.
And at the time, all of those people, all of those departments reported to the center director, mm-hmm. Ballhouse, and if he needed things done in legal, he could call up the head of legal, report it to him and say, hey, I have your review of that contract tomorrow, not 2 weeks from now. Mm-hmm. Get it done. Yep. And he could tell personnel, get those people hired in a month instead of a year. And it made things really easy to get things done. The other thing they were able to do was treat it as a sort of a one NASA project. Mm-hmm. So,
meaning what?
Well, NASA, like any large organization, has internal rivalries. There are 9 NASA centers. Mm-hmm. People say you work at NASA and they say, oh, you're in Houston. Well, no. I mean, actually, NASA headquarters is in Washington. Mm-hmm. There are 9 NASA centers that do various things. Right. There are 3 manned spaceflight centers, Johnson in Houston and Marshall in Huntsville, Alabama, mm-hmm. and Kennedy in, actually there are 4, Kennedy in Florida and Stennis in Mississippi, right. just across the river from New Orleans. There's 2 space science centers, JPL and Goddard. Mm-hmm. There's 3.5 research centers. I say half because the 4th one sometimes is part of Ames and sometimes isn't, right. Which is Langley in Virginia, Lewis, now called Glenn in Cleveland, Ames in Mountain View, mm-hmm. and Dryden, which is now called Armstrong, which is the NASA part of Edwards Air Force Base. Mm-hmm. So each of those centers is a partner but also a rival of the others. Rivals for permission to build buildings, rivals for money. And at the time when I got there, there were sort of these nascent AI organizations at many of the other centers, which certain people at those centers were jealous of Ames getting the responsibility. Mm-hmm. And when I first got there, the steering committee for assigning money to this right. was very political. Yeah. So one of the things I said to Lee Holcomb was, I'd like to replace the people on the steering committee with people at the centers who are really in it for building the whole NASA program. Right. And he said, yes, go ahead. And that was actually a bit of a fight to get some people who were more political than technical off that group. But headquarters backed us, and we ended up with a group of people who really did something that was very unusual at NASA. We assigned money based on merit mm-hmm. rather than by center allocation. Mm-hmm. So we developed a process for essentially receiving grant proposals from all of the centers for the work that we were going to do under this whole AI program. I co-chaired that with Mel Montemerlo. Right. We had representatives from every center on it. Right. And it took a little bit of prodding to get it to be a one NASA operation, but we really did. Okay. And so what evolved...
Can we go from that then to the actual kind of projects that you were doing?
Yeah, well, a little bit more detail that's necessary to understand. That ended up with being 2 research laboratories. Right. One at Ames, the largest one, okay. and a smaller but still very significant one at JPL, right. and applications projects at all of the centers. Okay. So at Ames, the goal was to hire very, very good research scientists, mm-hmm. Lead scientists who are good enough to be professors at Stanford or MIT or CMU, but also wore 2 hats, that they would do the basic research, but that wouldn't be the end of the stuff when they published. They would do what is ever necessary to take what they've done as basic research and turn it into NASA applications, right. Which we did. And over the period of, within 2 or 3 years, we had not only dozens of research publications, but also over a dozen fielded applications in NASA's main missions in space science, in human spaceflight, and in aeronautics. Mm-hmm. So that part of the period lasted from 87 until about 94, was sort of the golden age of doing this at NASA.
Right.
Not that we didn't have occasional problems. The hardest thing I ever had to do in the federal government was fire somebody. Believe me, you don't want to ever fire somebody in the government, but I had to. And that ended up going through 2 years of stuff ending up at the Supreme Court.
Okay.
Literally the Supreme Court, although they rejected the case. They were the final arbiter that was allowed to accept or reject a federal appeal case, and they did. But it went through all, including the Federal Court of Appeals for the Washington Circuit, the First Circuit Court, which takes all Washington, all government internal final appeals. In fact, is where most Supreme Court justices come from,
Right.
from there to there. So we had a program that grew in size,
Right.
from an original approximately $10 million program to a NASA-wide program of well over $100 million.
Okay. So $100 million program, headquartered here.
At Ames, yep.
More or less.
Well, headquartered at headquarters.
Headquartered, but you were the director of it here at
But co-managed by a group that a headquarters person and I co-led.
Okay.
And I was the director of the Ames laboratory.
And during this period, can you sort of get into some of the projects
Sure.
and the work that you were doing?
A lot of very interesting projects. One that we talked about, that Monty Zwiebin, who was on the group yesterday, developed. Monty became my deputy and also ran a project in constraint-based scheduling. And he glommed upon what was probably NASA's hardest scheduling problem as their domain to work in, which was the problem of scheduling what was called the processing of the space shuttle orbiters after they came home. And that was a process that originally was supposed to take 12 days.
Right.
I found out about this because the flow sheets that Monty showed me, there were 12 days on each of them, and I said, why is it 12? He said, oh yeah, that was the original plan, to turn around orbiters in 12 days and fly about 10 times as many missions as actually flew. It actually ended up taking about 2 months to process each orbiter. And this was the process done at Kennedy Space Center in what was called the orbiter processing facilities, and there were 2 of them, so you could process 2 orbiters at a time, essentially fixing up any damage, replacing tiles, putting more of the fuels and other
Supplies,
things, liquid supplies, gaseous supplies
Yep.
that you had to do. It was a complicated problem because there were a lot of constraints of timing of things, like when you were doing tiles, they used a very toxic adhesive to replace the tiles on the shuttle, and you couldn't have anyone else who wasn't in hazmat suits doing that. It was a very delicate process. It was a process that that cost the agency about $1 million a day, mostly in labor costs to what was then Lockheed Space Operations Corporation, and all overseen by a single guy called a flow manager. And Monty became very friendly with 2 of the flow managers, the one for Endeavor and one for Columbia. And at the time when we got in there, the scheduling was done literally by long sheets of paper on a wall, and people cut and pasted things, and their total budget per shuttle allocated for paper and X-Acto knives and glue was $12,000 per mission. Monty built a system, a just-in-time scheduling system and rescheduling system that enabled you to find correct solutions at any time that you had to reschedule, but they could stop at any time with a guaranteed correct solution. Might not be the optimal one, but some of these were timing dependent. It ended up replacing this totally manual system with a new computer graphical and automated system for those 2 shuttles. And the cost savings of the agency, mostly by reducing the need for weekend overtime, was well over $1 million per shuttle flight. And we ended up getting the largest ever Space Act award, monetary award, for service to NASA from that project. So that was a really interesting project. Advances in constraint-based scheduling, lots of good publications, and a book out of it, but also the application to NASA. Another very interesting, much more expert system project was something called PI in a box. There the goal was to, well, when you're a scientist, a space scientist in a laboratory at MIT or Rice or Stanford or somewhere, and want to do an experiment on the space shuttle. They're planned years in advance. If you're real lucky, you get space on the shuttle to do the experiment. And almost always it's a astronaut scientist who carries out the experiment. And it's a trained, what are called the mission specialists are trained astronauts. They're mission specialists, and there's pilots, pilot commanders, who are astronauts, who are usually former Air Force or Navy aviators, Air Force pilots and Navy aviators. The mission specialists are scientists who become astronauts. In fact, a colleague of mine shared an office with originally Ellen Ochoa at Ames, who ran a photonics laboratory, really wanted to be an astronaut, became an astronaut, became the first flautist in space. You're allowed to take one person item, and she was a symphony grade flautist. She took her flute. And later she became head of the astronaut office and is now the Kennedy Center director. But so those people are trained on your experiment, but they're not like you had your postdoc doing the experiment. If it broke, in most cases, that was it. You know, a power supply failed or something, and you know, this thing you had planned 7 or 8 years for was done, couldn't get done. They weren't capable of on-the-fly data analysis the way if you were on the ground. If you're doing an experiment in science and something interesting happens,
you can adjust the experiment.
Yeah, it might be the thing, wow, that's the discovery.
Yeah.
An anomaly might be eureka. You couldn't do that. And so analyzing the data and then replanning on the fly. So we wanted to do those 3 things for the experiment. And we collaborated with a very famous space scientist, Larry Young from MIT, who studies vestibular physiology in space, you know, or why humans throw up in zero gravity. He had several experiments on the shuttle to measure that, a thing called the rotating dome, which was this dome you put over you put your head into, where spots of different colors rotated, and apparently you could measure then eye motion and other things to help you understand how the human vestibular system changes under 0G. So Larry actually tried to become an astronaut. He was the world's oldest astronaut candidate. And he made it to the training phase, but not to actually flying. So we tried to replicate much of Larry's knowledge in this PI in a box experiment, which we actually flew on space. And it turned out the astronaut who used it was Shannon Lucid, who became famous because she was actually for a while the most number of hours logged because she was on Mir as a NASA astronaut on the Russian space station for a long period of time. And it worked. I mean, it was actually the first flight of a true laptop. We used the Apple PowerBook as the experiment. And we learned what it takes to fly something on the space shuttle. Like, you can't use the batteries on a portable laptop because they're worried that at the time the nickel cadmium batteries could explode. So we had to connect it to the shuttle supply, and we had to get a space-rated power cable. I remember once the project manager at the time, Silvano Colombano, who once a week came into my office and told me why we weren't going to fly. One time came in and said, "We're not going to fly," and I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, we need a space-rated power cable." Okay, what's the big deal about getting a 10-foot power cable? You know, it's 2 wires to 2 wires. What's the big deal? Well, it has to be space-rated. Well, okay, who does that? Well, there's a lab at MIT that's funded by Johnson Space Center that has a 2-year backlog. So at the time, this was before the internet. So my internet at the time for NASA was my collection of NASA phone books for each center. So I look in there and I look up, who's the head of the space flight projects branch at JSC? So I call up that person and get the branch chief, and he said, I said, well, I'm another NASA branch chief. What can you do to help me? And he said, well, the reason such a backlog is we can only afford 1 contractor at the lab to do it. And I said, well, tell you what, suppose I go 50-50 with you for the next year on another contractor. Will you put me first in line? And he said, you could do that? And I said, yeah, this is a couple $1 million project. I'm happy to send you $35K. So I called him my headquarters and said, call Mel Montemurlo, and I said, hey, Mel, is it okay if I send $35K to Johnson so we get a cable for the PI in the box? And he said, of course. So
the $35,000 cable, but more came out of it than that.
Well, it was less. It was $12K for the cable, but $35K for the contractor co-shared with JSC to make it do it. So we flew. So we flew PI in a box, and that was sort of the first expert system ever in space. Another really significant project was on the data analysis side. One of our best scientists was a guy named Peter Cheeseman, who was a Bayesian reasoner, and he designed a Bayesian classification system called AutoClass. And so when people talk about machine learning these days, almost entirely they're talking about supervised neural net-based classification systems. So the reason they work, it's an old idea. The idea is at least 35 years old. The reason it works so dramatically today is because of two things that are totally apart from AI. One is the availability of huge amounts of accessible training data for almost anything. So, you know, if you want to train a system to determine, to classify dogs and cats, there's millions and millions of pictures of dogs and cats on the internet, and you can have people on Amazon Turk label them dogs or cats, and then you can give that training data to your neural net. And it works. And the other thing, that takes lots and lots of computing power. People discovered that GPUs that were originally designed as graphical processing units for, you know, gaming computers and the like, are wonderful for running those deep learning neural nets. And so huge amounts of specialized computing power, huge amounts of data makes supervised learning systems do dramatic things. Now, the goal we had was to do unsupervised learning. You get data from a space mission, an astronomical mission. It's studying things in the infrared or the UV or the visible. The goal, you don't have them classified because that's the job. Which blob is a galaxy? Which blob is a nebula? You know, which blob is a quasar? Now, human scientists do that off the photographic data. Peter's system, in theory, found where the classes were. It said, okay, there seem to be 4 distinct classes of stuff. Peter's system looked at the infrared astronomical satellite data. That was our test bed. Lots and lots of data. Image type data in the UV, in the IR, excuse me, and said there's this many classes and here's what's in each class. And the astronomers looked at that and said, yeah, that's better than we did in pulling things out. This class is clearly galaxy, this class is clearly nebula, it's clearly quasars. Let's replace our former catalog, it was about this thick, of astronomical objects with the one you guys gave us. Human beings still said what the meaning was. I mean, the system didn't say this is a galaxy. It said this is a class of things. And there are this many classes of things. So it worked remarkably well, and you know the proof was, as I said, I have this catalog that the astronomers adopted as the classification catalog for the infrared astronomical satellite. And you know those are 3 examples. I can probably give you a dozen more, but those are 3 different classes of examples. And in each case, working with human experts was key. In the case of the scheduling system, working with Eric Clanton and Wayne, forget his last name, who were the flow managers. On a it was important. In the case of IRAS, working with the infrared astronomers. In the case of PI in the Box, working really closely with Larry Young is what mattered.
We need to move on to Intraspect.
Yes.
Talk to me about the transition from NASA to Intraspect.
Well, starting in mid-1994, the NASA administrator, who'd been a good guy, was replaced by Dan Golden, who could best be described as NASA's Rasputin. He was a madman. NASA, in its best of times, is normally a meritocracy. You know, lots of incredibly smart people there. I mean, you really can't get too much of an ego when you're associating with people like Jeff Cuzzy was one of our collaborators. He's the chief project scientist on the Cassini mission. His nickname is Lord of the Rings. You know, if you're around people like that, just like being at Stanford around people like Josh Lederberg, you can't get too much of a swelled head. But in the best of times, NASA meritocracy. When Golden came in, it turned out the primary criterion for his lieutenants were people who would tell him how wonderful he was. Reminiscent of certain other things. But NASA went from being a meritocracy to being very political. He had fired, for reasons that I could go into, it's about an hour to go
Right.
into, but I won't.
Because we
He
have more important
he
things.
fired the AIM center director,
Right.
replaced him with someone who was, by all standards, totally incompetent to be there. In fact, a very strong belief, which is probably true, that he picked someone who would give him an excuse to close Ames.
Okay.
And the people who were not good enough to prosper in a meritocracy came out of the woods, and it was becoming a very unpleasant place to work. It was obvious that I could no longer really do my job appropriately.
Okay.
I was told, good news, we don't have to work with people at other centers anymore. Headquarters will decide who gets what. And so it was pretty clear that we'd had a great run, but the structure we had built couldn't survive. Best people would leave, so I left.
So you left, and so Intraspect, what was the thought for that?
Well, I had done a short tenure at a company called EIC, which was one of the early internet enabled companies, and had met Tom Gruber,
Right.
who I'd known earlier, was a fellow, a later PhD student of Ed Feigenbaum's,
Right.
and a guy named Craig Weir, who had been an ARPA project manager. And we were all at this little company trying to develop web-based applications. It turned out that it wasn't the right setting for us because the company wanted to stay small and do little projects, and we had what we thought was a big idea.
Yeah.
So we left. The big idea was what came to be called knowledge management,
Okay.
which was making a corporate memory for an organization,
Right.
so that you could reuse rather than reinvent. That in large organizations, if you have a problem to solve, the odds are very, very high that somebody else somewhere in your organization has solved a similar problem already, if it's a large enough organization. But in most companies, trying to find out who that person was and how it was done and why it was done is nearly impossible. I mean, companies have a couple 100,000, companies like Citicorp have hundreds of thousands of employees. So Tom was one of the very first people to combine email with the web. He had built a system at Stanford originally that produced a web-based mail system.
Right.
And he viewed the integration of unstructured data, meaning everything from Word documents, PowerPoint, email, web conversations, blogs, video, everything that isn't in a relational database. Integrating that into a corporate memory system so you could find it, subscribe to it, and find it in the context of prior use was important. So we formed a company called, actually it was originally called Colloquy, Collokui.
Right.
We later changed it to Intraspect, mainly because Tom hated the name Colloquy. He originally liked it, and then he decided he hated it. And since he was our CTO, we agreed to change the name. And it was a better name. We all agreed. Started a company, got venture funding, did the rounds with the idea, and began Intraspect. Started I guess in 1996. It grew. We attracted increasing amounts of venture capital, found a bunch of corporate partners, developed the system through many levels of development. Went through a couple CEOs, as we talked about yesterday. Hard to find CEOs that are good enough, that satisfy all your venture capitalists at the same time. I was CEO for a while, until we got our third major round of funding, and we were growing enough that we realized that I should find somebody who, now when it was becoming a sales-oriented company, as we developed this as a product, a shrink-wrapped product, the Intraspect knowledge management system. And we started winning awards from the major analyst groups and so on, and developed a market. The goal was to find somebody who was much more knowledgeable about sales and marketing than I was. And we found a CEO, Jim Flaging, and it was time to go public. Unfortunately, we missed our timing by about 3 months. Company had grown to the size where the valuation, according to the bright young MBAs who came over from Morgan Stanley, who was our underwriter, told us it was going to be a $500 million valuation. And then the market went, this was in, had written the S1, about to go public in about May of 2000. When the technology bubble went boom.
It started sliding down.
More than sliding, it went boom. I mean, we're talking 3 months after the bright young MBAs told us our God-given valuation is 500 million. The same bright young MBAs explained our God-given valuation was 35 million.
Right.
And our board, which at that time had people like Michael Boskin, and a famous economist on it, said to Morgan Stanley, we really should wait 6 months when the market recovers.
Right.
That 6 months turned out to be about 10 years.
Yes.
So unable to raise funds in the public market, although we had grown to an expense level. I mean, this was a time in Silicon Valley when the company board voted to spend $1 million. We were in this building just north of SFO, right, in Brisbane, right, off 101, right, and the top floor of a new building that had been built, 10-story building. And they wanted signage so we could attract the best sales guys. Right. So $1 million for signage on the building. I voted against it. I was the only person voting against it on our board at the time. When it later became time to cut back because the availability of funds, yep, was hard, and also where, besides the market crash in valuations, what it meant was it was harder to sell into the big organizations that were our market, because they wanted guarantees that the company they were buying from would be around. Right. Because not only were they buying a major software package, they were buying services for it. And it was really hard to be, only a few companies were big enough, yeah, for companies to trust. So even though we were a far superior product to something like SharePoint, which was a competitor, but not really, from Microsoft, right, they knew buying a far inferior product for more money, but from a company that would be around, was a lot safer. Right. So new sales were drying up. Mm-hmm. More money now was on our service, our support side, yep, than on our product side. And eventually the company, the VCs, decided they were going to try to get some of their money back and sold the company, right, for $35 million. And that was in late 2002, at which time a very interesting development happened. Mm-hmm. Coincident almost with that time, I'd gotten a call from, by this time, the new AIM Center director. A new NASA administrator had been appointed. Golden had been replaced. The new guy saw what was happening at Ames and replaced that center director, right, with actually a good person. Right. That person sort of got the history of what had happened, called me up and said, look, I want to apologize to you for everything that was done at Ames. Would, right, you consider coming back as our chief technologist? Yep. Which I did, and for somewhat bizarre reasons, during the time I was at Ames, from 2003 to 2006, I was actually the highest paid employee at NASA. For a sort of interesting, bizarre reason. At the time, the NASA administrator was Sean O'Keefe, right, who was the most political and least technical administrator NASA ever had. He was a protege, yeah, of the vice presidents of Dick Cheney. Right. And so his goal, he basically left the technologists alone, which was good. Mm-hmm. And he had people underneath him who were good. Yeah. But his goal, at the time, you may remember there was a presidential scorecard for federal agencies. Right. You could be red, green, or yellow, yep, at about 8 categories, like personnel, finance, project planning, something like that. So nobody was green on everything. Right. And one of his goals was to take NASA from a yellow to a green on personnel. Mm-hmm. At the time, there was a little-known federal thing called accepted science and technology positions. Mm-hmm. There were only 4 of them in the government at the time because no one really knew about the process. But if you could basically make an argument that a science or technology person was essential to the agency, right, you could get a position where you were waived all the normal salary requirements. You could be paid up to the vice president's level. Right. Okay. So I went back, and the center director, Scott Hubbard, said, okay, Sean wants us to do what we can to use this position. And I said to Scott, well, yeah, okay, can you really make an argument that me, a computer scientist, that NASA would fall apart if you didn't have me? You know, just give me the SES slot that we talked about. He said, well, no, Sean really wants this. And since he's the one who's going to approve it at the NASA level, and he just came from being deputy director of OMB, which has the final, Office of Management Body, has the final approval, it'll probably get approved. And I said, oh, okay, fine, if you want to pay me more than your salary, go ahead. And so I said, okay, but if we don't get, this was in, I think, around September. And so, but if this isn't done by Christmas, let's go back to the default state. So it goes along, and we hear that it's been approved by Sean O'Keefe and approved by Office of Personnel Management, but it's sitting at OMB.
Right.
So a week before Christmas, head of personnel calls me up and says, you're not going to believe this, it was actually approved. So, fine. It was called an STEX position.
Right. And you were the fifth.
So I was the fifth of the government. I had been president of NASA for a short period of time.
Right.
I stayed on, I was chief technologist. You know, we did a lot of interesting things in developing some of the new sciences at NASA and nanotechnology and the like. I ended up leaving NASA 3 years later because the new NASA administrator fired Scott. And basically said there won't be any more basic research at NASA because we can't afford it, because we have to get the shuttle replacement done. So once again, NASA went from being a good place to work to being a bad place to work if you wanted to develop long-term science and technology. And
at that point, just going over the sort of the 3 years, you're overseeing all research that Ames is looking at, correct?
All S&T, and in fact, NASA itself had gone from a new way of managing its money. Previously, money had been in distinct categories. Money for salaries was different than money for travel, different from money for research grants, and that you could never cross the money. It went for a system where all money was in one pot, and your job was to manage it. Along with that, each center had the right to put aside a certain amount of money for internal R&D, IRAD as it was called. So I managed that budget, which was sort of a free pot of money to encourage people to do innovative, usually interdisciplinary things. So for the first one I ever funded was sort of interesting. We got together the people who'd been developing thermal materials, like heat shields, with the people who'd been doing nanotechnology to see if we could develop a material shield that would be both a heat shield and a radiation shield at the same time.
Right.
So yeah, I managed that. I was the center's Center Director's Chief Advisor on Science and Technology, a member of the Executive Council, and head of New Business Development at the center. So under Scott, that was great. When Scott I tended to leave NASA when my Center Director was fired.
And so that moved you on to FX.
Yeah, I had gone to
FX Palo Alto.
I'd gone to FX Palo Alto is the research laboratory for Fuji Xerox.
And so that makes it the successor of Xerox PARC in some long way.
No, not the successor. It was on the same campus as PARC, but was a completely separate laboratory as part of the Japanese company, Fuji Xerox. Fuji Xerox is not part of Xerox. Fuji Xerox is a joint venture between Fujifilm and Xerox that is owned like 70-30 between Fujifilm and Xerox actually divested itself of it entirely later. And I was hired to turn the laboratory into a Silicon Valley laboratory. In other words, be like a Google. Lots of people arguing in the halls at all time, everyone there nights and weekends, all the usual stuff. It turned out after a year of trying to do that, that wasn't really what the company wanted. It turned out, despite them saying that, they wanted more a vanity laboratory to say they had one in Silicon Valley. And realized that, even though they were paying me a lot, life was short. And there are better things to do. So I went from there to what I've been doing for the last 10 years.
Which is your own consulting firm?
Which is, well, my own consulting, but almost entirely for the Air Force. I'd done a little bit of consulting work for NASA and for University of California. But the real fit came about when Ed Feigenbaum, Ed had been chief scientist of the Air Force as one of his tenures. And one of the things he had done was help the Air Force set up its Asia Pacific office. Air Force Office of Scientific Research funds about $500 million of basic science worldwide. So unlike the NSF, the Air Force looks for basic research wherever it can find it in almost every country of the world, except a few you can probably guess. And I really liked that idea of global science. Ed had been the chief advisor to AFOSR on a bunch of these things. He was going to retire from that, and he asked me if I'm interested to do it, and he introduced me to Brendan Godfrey, who was the head of AFOSR, and to Ken Garetta, who was the head of the Asia office, and we hit it off. So originally I spent most of my time sort of as a talent scout in the Asia Pacific region, which means leading tours of the various universities and research centers to find good places for the Air Force to invest. I also ended up helping develop the AFOSR-wide autonomous system programs, which had sort of fallen into disrepair from the programs of about 20 years ago. I helped recreate them and became an advisor to the head of the organization and the chief scientist. Besides doing these scouting trips in Europe now and in South America. One of the things that the Air Force has is a personnel problem in that getting people with the right technical skills to be program officers in the foreign offices is very difficult because most of the program officers are PhD lieutenant colonels. But the system that assigns them to jobs only very loosely looks at their qualifications in any one technical discipline. It's like who's available. So I ended up becoming mentored to 3 successive program officers for information sciences in the Asia Pacific region, and 1 in the South American region, who weren't computer scientists. So I had to teach them about AI and autonomous systems and the like. And they were great. They really wanted to learn, and we became great partners, and ended up doing 2, 3, 4 trips a year to the various regions. Another thing I did was the chief scientist about 4 years ago, Chuck Mattson, and I both believed that AFOSR wasn't taking into account enough what are really the long-term needs of the Air Force. That doing basic research at a mission agency like NASA or the Air Force was different than doing basic research at NSF. You still want to do fundamental research. The research itself doesn't have to be tied to a specific military application. But if a 4-star general comes by and asks, so why are you doing this crazy stuff? The program officer ought to be able to say, if this crazy stuff succeeds, it will help enable
us to do this.
The following class of things in the future. So the program officers need to know enough about the place they work to be able to, from a vast amount of basic research they can do, not tell their university grantees you have to work in a military domain, but have the notion of why doing this work in planning, why doing this work in nanomaterials. If it may not succeed, that's okay. But if it succeeds, why it was valuable to the organization. And in fact, there's a really good book called Third Generation Research that most people read it and they get the wrong thing from it. It tells you how to build all these bubble graphs and things. So like if you make these bubble graphs, magically you'll be doing good stuff. But in there is one really important concept for the CTO of any large organization. Be able to understand why, if long-term research that may not succeed does succeed, why it was worth the investment. The worst thing, it's like the play The Producers, the worst thing is if you invest $N million in a research project, it succeeds, and it wasn't worth the $N million. So Chuck asked me to basically do a short-term study of talking to people at the real Air Force missions. What plausibly were their long-term capability needs, and tie that to technology and tie the technology to basic research. So we'd sort of a plan for doing that. It worked out well. He really liked the result of that. So then we embarked on a 1.5-year, more comprehensive study to do exactly that. That would also have the side effect of engaging enough people within the Air Force operations and research establishment that they would buy into the final document we produced. And we finished that work a few months ago, and it's in its final form now. but that was a very, very interesting project to do for the Air Force. So, I mean, I've been essentially working half-time, full-time for the Air Force under various mechanisms. Every time a mechanism for hiring me works, after it's done, somebody decides it was improper, so my book about the Air Force is going to be subtitled, "If It Ain't Broke, Break It." And this isn't just true for me. I mean, it's like the Air Force is in the state that is the bad state for an organization that NASA became when somebody decided, headquarters decided the bright idea was to have legal and financial and procurement and personnel not report to the center director, but report up the chain, several levels, which meant now their job was to protect the guy several levels up for any embarrassment, as opposed to getting the mission done. And unfortunately, the Air Force in peacetime is in that state. I'm not hoping for a war, but I do know in wartime it reverts to get the mission done. So getting things done is aggravating, because things you would think should take a week or two to do end up taking 8 or 9 months. And so that's the frustrating part of the Air Force. The good part of the Air Force is that there are a lot of awfully smart people and really interesting things to accomplish. And it's really you get a lot of satisfaction from watching something proceed up that chain. I'll just give you one example of that. 8 years ago, on my very first scouting trip 9 years ago to Australia, found a group at a group called NICTA, which is a academic government commercial set of labs. National Information and Communications Technology Australia, it stood for. It's been renamed recently to Data 61. But a group of researchers there who are doing amazingly good work in complete, provable validation of operating system kernels. So you know exactly, they're hacker-proof if the research succeeds. The research went really well, won several major Australian awards for best computer science research, what we funded. We turned it into applied work. It went from AFOSR to one of the Air Force research laboratories funding them to make it a full-type system. DARPA adopted it as part of their project for an autonomous helicopter, making it the kernel of the operating system on this autonomous helicopter, making it provably hacker-proof, the helicopter. And the DARPA demonstration project flew. And it was great to see the evolution of that from very basic research through applied stuff to a flying helicopter in a relatively short period of time. So that's the kind of things that really excite me when we do that.
Okay. This is the point where you get to add what you would like to that I didn't lead you into.
What I'd like to, I didn't lead you.
What subject would you feel needs to be part of this that I have not touched?
Well, let's see. I captained Stanford's national winning College Bowl team.
Good.
We beat Yale in the finals.
Excellent.
I don't know. I think we've covered most of the issues. I think that the things that I think I'm most interested in, I really like, and I've liked it since being engaged in it at Princeton, the notion of interdisciplinary work, of where is the intersection between computer science and cognitive science and things. So one of the programs I helped start at AFOSR, I think is actually the very best example of that. One of the things that military, DoD, has put at the very top of their list, in fact we talked about it a little yesterday, is the notion of effective human-machine teams, where the machine agents, whether they're robots or analyst computer systems or whatever, make the transition from tool to partner. And achieving that transition is inherently a multidisciplinary process. So we have a program in human-machine trust and effectiveness at AFOSR that funds grants in 15 different countries, because that's inherently a multicultural issue. Right. The way in which face-oriented societies is different than the way in which honor-oriented societies is different from the way in which dignity-oriented societies like ours, merit-based societies, react. So at our last program review of that, there were 15 countries represented and 12 different scientific disciplines: philosophers, computer scientists, cognitive scientists, experimental psychologists, anthropologists, sociologists, a couple others, and that was just great. Among other things I enjoyed there is I get to learn one new word per program review. The latest, my favorite one, from the anthropologist, I learned the word hypergeny.
Hypergeny.
You know what that is?
No.
Hypergeny means marrying up.
Okay, that sounds good.
So attaining social status or wealth or whatever by marrying someone upward from your social status
and
or whatever.
Here's the deal, in every couple, there's always one that does that.
Yeah, well, ideally they're both, but both think that. So I learned that from one of our anthropologists at UCLA at our last program review. So that has been something that I think I've been totally fascinated by throughout my career. The notion, it's really fun to work with people outside your own narrow discipline. So like when I go to an AI conference, I tend to avoid what I think are the really boring machine learning talks on 0.5% improvement on the back propagation algorithm. And I tend to go to those talks where I see people talking about, there was a great talk from some of the Cornell folks on work they had done with material scientists on automated discovery of new materials. So those are the kind of things I really like helping fund and hearing about.
Well, thank you very much for this.
Oh, and I'm sorry, I'll add one other thing. I actually did meet my wife through the MOLGEN project.
Okay.
It turns out she's a she was a cancer biologist, one of the first group of cancer biologists that graduated from Stanford, and she turned out to work on our on the MOLGEN project as a domain expert too.
But there you are.
So, met her at graduate student housing, and we ended up being partners both in life and for a while in research. So,
there you go. Good. Well, thank you.
Thank you.